The first bell of the morning echoed down the halls of Maplewood High, a low hum that bounced off lockers and tiled floors. Students rushed past each other, balancing textbooks, phones, and fragments of half-finished conversations. The smell of disinfectant and warm printer ink floated in the air, a smell that only schools seemed to have. In room 2B, Eli Turner sat quietly near the window, sketching tiny shapes in the corner of his notebook. He liked mornings like this, quiet, routine, predictable. The world hadn't yet demanded too much of him. 14 years old, shy but observant, Eli wasn't the kind of kid people noticed. He was polite, never late, never loud. His teachers often forgot he was in class, except when they marked attendance. But that morning something inside him stirred, a kind of nervous determination. He had spent all weekend trying to understand a single math problem. Fractions. Division. Why you flip one and multiply the other. Everyone else seemed to get it easily. But not him. His mother's words echoed in his mind. If you don't understand something, ask. There's no shame in learning. So he made himself a promise. Today he would ask. The door opened sharply at 8:05 a.m., and Mr. Henderson walked in. His shoes clicked against the floor with military precision. He was tall, neatly dressed, and carried a steaming mug of coffee that smelled bitter and strong. "Good morning," he said, his tone neutral, as though he had already said it too many times in his life. "Open your books to page 43. We're continuing with fraction division." The class obeyed. Pages fluttered. Chairs scraped. Someone groaned quietly. Mr. Henderson was a good teacher, on paper. His students scored well, his lessons were organized, and his rules were strict but clear. But warmth wasn't his strength. His classroom was a place of order, not curiosity. He began writing on the chalkboard. White dust floated in the sunlight as he drew neat rows of numbers. 3/4 divided by 2/5 equals. His voice was crisp. When we divide fractions, we invert the second one, the divisor, and multiply. Like so. Chalk squeaked across the board. Eli followed the steps with his eyes, but not with his mind. He could repeat them, but he couldn't explain them, not even to himself. He raised his hand slowly. "Mr. Henderson?" The teacher turned, surprised. Eli rarely spoke. "Yes, Eli." Eli hesitated, his throat suddenly dry. I don't understand why we flip the second fraction. I mean, I get that we do it, but why does that work?" The room went silent. A few students turned in their seats. One boy in the back snickered. Mr. Henderson blinked once, then set the chalk down. His tone turned sharp. "You don't understand why. Eli, this is middle school math. This should have been clear years ago." Laughter rippled through the class. Eli's ears burned. "I just wanted to know how it works," he said softly, his voice fading. Mr. Henderson sighed loudly, an exaggerated sound that filled the room. "It works because it works. You're overcomplicating something simple. Now, let's move on." He turned back to the board. The chalk resumed its rhythm, harsh, dry, final. Eli's question hung in the air, unanswered and unwanted. For the rest of the lesson, Eli said nothing. He copied the examples mechanically, not seeing the numbers, only hearing echoes, laughter, whispers, the teacher's dismissive tone. When the bell rang, the class burst into noise. Chairs scraped, backpacks zipped, conversations resumed. A few students glanced his way, smirking. One boy muttered under his breath as he passed, "Dumb question, dude." Eli kept his head down, pretending not to hear. He packed his notebook carefully, as if neatness could somehow protect his pride. He was the last to leave. Outside, the hallway buzzed with life again, but he felt detached, like someone watching from behind glass. He didn't notice the eyes that followed him through the door. Next door, Mrs. Collins, the English teacher, had seen everything. Through the small rectangular window in her classroom door, she had watched the exchange between teacher and student. She had seen Eli's hesitation, heard the laughter, and watched his shoulders sink. She frowned. Mr. Henderson was an efficient teacher, but she'd long felt his strictness bordered on cruelty. To him, mistakes were laziness. Confusion was weakness. She sighed, closing her book. She knew how moments like that could linger, not just for a day, but for years. In her 20 years of teaching, she'd seen bright, curious kids stop asking questions altogether. Not because they didn't care, but because someone made them feel foolish for trying. She tore a piece of paper from her notebook and scribbled a reminder. Talk to Principal Miller about Eli. Then she slipped it into her planner and returned to grading essays. But her mind stayed with the boy in the window seat, the one whose courage had just been crushed. The sky turned gold as the final bell rang. Students spilled into the streets, laughing, shouting, alive with freedom. Eli walked home slowly, backpack heavy on his shoulders. The sidewalk stretched endlessly ahead of him. Every step replayed the morning like a broken film reel. The question, the laughter, the teacher's voice. At one point, he stopped in front of a puddle on the sidewalk. The reflection looked back at him, a boy with tired eyes and a frown too old for his age. He whispered to himself, "Maybe I shouldn't have asked." A breeze rustled the trees above. The world didn't answer. When he reached home, his mother greeted him with her usual warmth. "Hey, sweetie, how was school?" He hesitated, forcing a smile. "It was fine." "Did you ask your teacher that question about fractions?" she asked, rinsing vegetables in the sink. He nodded. "Yeah." Her face lit up. "That's my brave boy. See, you'll get it now." He smiled back, a small, tired curve of his lips, and quickly escaped to his room. Inside, he dropped his backpack on the floor and sat at his desk. The sunlight from his window fell across his math notebook. He opened it, staring at the problem on the page. 3/4 divided by 2/5. He flipped the second fraction and multiplied, just like the teacher said. The answer came out fine, but it didn't feel fine. He closed the notebook and picked up a pencil. Slowly, he began to draw. A boy sitting in a classroom, surrounded by shadows that whispered in his ear. Over his head floated a single word bubble with a question mark inside it. Beneath it, he wrote quietly, "Don't ask." The next day at school, Eli kept to himself. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't make eye contact with the teacher. Mr. Henderson noticed, but said nothing. The lesson continued, efficient and cold. A few students still joked about the dumb question, but by the end of the week, the laughter faded. For everyone else, it was old news. For Eli, it wasn't. It had become part of him, a quiet lesson learned the hard way. Curiosity could hurt. Meanwhile, Mrs. Collins didn't forget. She waited until Friday afternoon, when most students had gone home, to walk down to the principal's office. She knocked on the open door. Principal Miller, a calm man in his 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, looked up from his desk. "Mrs. Collins, what can I do for you?" She hesitated, then said softly, "It's about one of our teachers, and one of our students." The principal gestured for her to sit. "Go on." As she spoke, Miller listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Leave it with me. I'll handle it." Outside, the last light of the day spilled through the blinds, painting the office walls gold. Mrs. Collins stood to leave, relieved but uncertain. "He's a good kid, you know. Just needed someone to answer him kindly." The principal nodded. "And maybe that's a lesson we all need reminding of." That evening, as the building emptied, Principal Miller sat in silence. He thought about how a single careless moment could shape a child's belief in themselves. And he decided this wouldn't be ignored. The next morning, Eli walked into Maplewood High with the same blue backpack and the same quiet steps, but something inside him had changed. The halls that once buzzed with harmless chatter now seemed louder, filled with sounds that felt sharper, more pointed. He kept his head down as he made his way to room 2B. Every whisper, every burst of laughter felt like it might be about him, even when it wasn't. His mind replayed the day before, the question, the laughter, the look on Mr. Henderson's face, over and over again, like a film that refused to stop looping. When he stepped into the classroom, he felt eyes on him. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe not. He walked quickly to his seat near the window, the one place that still felt like his. The morning light fell on his desk, but it didn't warm him like it used to. Mr. Henderson entered as usual, carrying his mug of coffee, a stack of papers, and that same air of precision. "Good morning," he said, his tone clipped. "Good morning," the class echoed, everyone except Eli. He didn't look up once. By lunchtime, the story had already spread, passed from one mouth to another, reshaped with each retelling. "Did you hear about Eli in math class?" "Yeah, he asked why you flip fractions. Like, who doesn't know that? I mean, I kinda get it, but still." Mr. Henderson totally roasted him. Some students laughed about it. Others shrugged, already forgetting. But the whispers floated like ghosts through the corridors, brushing against Eli wherever he went. When he entered the cafeteria, conversations softened. A few glances darted his way, then quickly turned back to trays of pizza and fries. He walked to a corner table near the window and opened his lunchbox. Peanut butter and jelly again. He stared at it for a moment before closing the lid. His appetite was gone. Two friends from his class, Nora and Liam, sat a few tables away. Nora waved hesitantly. "Hey, Eli, come sit with us." He pretended not to hear. The thought of sitting there, pretending everything was fine, made his stomach twist. He walked instead toward the courtyard, where the wind carried the faint smell of grass and asphalt. He sat on a bench, alone, and took out his sketchbook. He began to draw, small shapes, random lines, until the page filled with messy scribbles. In the center, he drew a boy sitting under a storm cloud while everyone around him walked in sunshine. He stared at the drawing for a long time. Then he turned the page. That afternoon, Mr. Henderson sat in the teacher's lounge grading quizzes. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence. He sipped his coffee and frowned slightly. He remembered Eli's question, and the laughter that followed. Part of him felt a faint sting of guilt, though he didn't want to name it. Maybe I was too harsh, he thought. But these kids need discipline. The world won't go easy on them. He told himself it was for Eli's own good. That embarrassment was a small price for learning to be more careful, more prepared. Students needed thick skin. The world rewarded confidence, not hesitation. Still, something about the look on the boy's face lingered. He shook it off, scribbling red marks on another paper. "Kids these days are too sensitive," he muttered. They'll survive. Outside the lounge window, Mrs. Collins walked past with a pile of essays. She glanced inside briefly, her eyes landing on Mr. Henderson for just a second, a quiet, knowing glance. He looked away. Over the next few days, Eli grew quieter. He no longer volunteered answers. He didn't raise his hand. When the teacher asked questions, he kept his eyes on his notebook, praying not to be called on. At recess, he sat under the same maple tree near the edge of the playground, the one that had always comforted him. Its leaves rustled gently above, whispering secrets to the wind. Sometimes his friends tried to talk to him, but his replies were short, automatic. "Hey, you okay?" Nora asked one afternoon. "Yeah." "You sure? You've been quiet." "Just tired." She didn't push further. She didn't know how. Eli's world was shrinking, slowly but surely. He moved through school like a ghost, present but unseen. One day, during English class, Mrs. Collins asked everyone to write a short essay about courage. Most students groaned, but Eli just stared at the blank page. After several minutes, he wrote one sentence. "Sometimes courage is asking a question even when you're afraid of the answer." He stared at it, then crossed it out. When Mrs. Collins later collected the papers, she noticed the faint indentation of the erased line. Her eyes softened. Principal Miller had always believed schools were more than test scores and grades. To him, they were small worlds, mirrors of humanity, with every act of kindness or cruelty rippling through unseen corners. That week, he'd noticed subtle things: a student who no longer spoke in class, a teacher who avoided eye contact in the hallway, and a few murmured rumors about that math class incident. He didn't intervene right away. He preferred to watch, to understand before acting. On Thursday morning, as students filed into their classrooms, he stood at the end of the hallway. His hands were clasped behind his back, eyes thoughtful. He saw Eli walking quietly toward room 2B. The boy's shoulders were slightly hunched, his gaze low. Something about that posture, that defeated stillness, told him more than any report ever could. After Eli disappeared into the classroom, Miller turned to Mrs. Collins, who was pinning new papers to the bulletin board nearby. "You were right," he said quietly. She looked up. "About what?" He nodded toward the classroom door. "That something happened. You can see it in the way he walks." Mrs. Collins sighed. "He's a good boy, Principal Miller. He just needed understanding, not ridicule." Miller's expression remained calm, but his eyes were sharp. "I'll take care of it," gently. Days turned into weeks, and life at Maplewood carried on, at least on the surface. The laughter in the hallways returned, assignments piled up, and teachers hurried through lessons. But for Eli, something remained broken. He still showed up. He still did his homework. But the spark was gone. When teachers asked questions, he stayed silent. When his mother asked how school was, he always said, "Fine." One evening, while helping her clean the table, she noticed his silence. "Eli, are you sure everything's okay?" He nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, Mom. Everything's fine." But later that night, she found his sketchbook left open on the desk. On one page, he'd drawn a classroom, empty, except for a single chair in the back row. Above it, he'd written, "Sometimes silence is safer." She sat there for a long time, her heart heavy with a feeling she couldn't quite name. Meanwhile, in his office, Principal Miller sat at his desk, reviewing the week's reports. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Eli. He opened a blank notepad and wrote one sentence at the top. "A small wound left untreated can become a scar." He underlined it once, then leaned back in his chair. The hum of the old ceiling fan filled the quiet room. He decided that tomorrow he'd start watching more closely, not just Eli, but the teacher too, because sometimes justice began not with confrontation, but with observation. The day began like any other, the sound of lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking, and the low murmur of students exchanging morning gossip. But beneath the surface, something felt different at Maplewood High. Rumors had faded over the past few weeks, but their traces lingered, floating through the air like dust that refused to settle. Eli walked through the halls quietly, as he always did now, his head down, his steps small. He had learned how to disappear, how to blend into the background so seamlessly that even the teachers barely noticed. But not everyone was blind. That morning Mr. Rivera, the school janitor, was making his usual rounds, mopping floors, emptying bins, humming an old tune from his youth. He had worked at Maplewood for 15 years. He'd seen children grow up, teachers come and go, and small moments that revealed who people truly were when no one else was looking. When he passed by room 2B, he paused. The door was slightly ajar, and he heard Mr. Henderson's voice from inside, sharper than usual. "You kids need to toughen up. The world won't give you gold stars for every question you ask." A few nervous laughs followed. Mr. Rivera frowned. He had heard similar tones before, from coaches who shouted more than they taught, from teachers who mistook fear for respect. He moved on with his mop, but something about that tone bothered him. Later that afternoon, as he emptied the trash near the teacher's lounge, he overheard Mrs. Collins speaking softly to another teacher. "Eli Turner, the boy in Henderson's class. He hasn't been the same since that day." Mr. Rivera froze for a moment, his hand still on the trash bin handle. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the concern in her voice caught his heart. That night, after everyone left, he swept the empty halls alone. The school was silent, lit only by the glow of emergency lights. He paused outside room 2B again, staring through the small window. The classroom was dark, the desks neatly lined. He sighed. "Kids remember more than we think," he whispered to himself. The next morning, Principal Miller received an unexpected visit. Mr. Rivera knocked gently on his office door, his cap in his hands. "Morning, sir. Got a minute?" "Of course, Joe," Miller said, motioning for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" Mr. Rivera hesitated, glancing at the open door before lowering his voice. "It's about one of the teachers, Henderson. I think he's been rough on one of the kids. The boy, Eli Turner." Miller leaned forward, his calm expression never changing. "Go on." Mr. Rivera explained what he'd seen and heard, the harsh tone, the rumors, the quiet change in Eli's behavior. He wasn't accusing anyone. He was just telling the truth, the way someone does when they care but don't want trouble. When he finished, Miller nodded slowly. "Thank you, Joe. You did the right thing." The janitor stood, adjusting his cap. "He's a good kid, that one. Just shy. Doesn't deserve to be made to feel small." Miller smiled faintly. "No child does." When the door closed, the principal sat still for a long time. He had already sensed something, Mrs. Collins's words, the whispers in the halls, but this confirmed it. Now it wasn't just intuition, it was fact. He opened his notebook and wrote one line. "Truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through the right people." Over the next week, Principal Miller began his quiet investigation. He didn't call anyone to his office. He didn't issue warnings or send emails. Instead, he chose to observe. Each morning, he took a walk through the classrooms, something he often did, but this time with purpose. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished floors. When he entered room 2B, Mr. Henderson smiled politely. "Good morning, Principal Miller. Just in time. We're doing a problem-solving session." Miller nodded, returning the smile. "Wonderful. Please, continue." He stood at the back of the room, watching. Eli sat near the window, as always. He was quiet, focused on his notebook, careful never to speak. The class was orderly, perhaps too orderly. No hands raised, no discussion, only instruction. Mr. Henderson's voice filled the room, steady and controlled, but Miller caught the edges, a sharpness that turned every correction into a judgment. When a girl made a small mistake while reading an equation, Henderson sighed loudly. "We've been through this already, Chloe. You're not listening." The girl's face fell. The rest of the class shifted uncomfortably. Miller's eyes narrowed slightly, though he said nothing. When the lesson ended, he thanked the teacher and left. But before turning the corner, he paused and looked back through the window. Eli stayed seated long after the others had left, staring at the board as if trying to understand something that couldn't be written in numbers. That evening, Principal Miller sat at his desk long after sunset. The campus was empty except for the sound of wind brushing against the windows. He opened his folder, where he kept handwritten notes about each classroom visit. He reread the latest one. Henderson's class. High discipline, low warmth. Students silent. Fear mistaken for focus. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. His mind drifted back to his early days as a teacher, before the title, before the office, before the paperwork. He remembered a boy who had once asked him a silly question about poetry. He'd been impatient then, too focused on finishing the lesson to nurture curiosity. The boy never spoke again in class after that. Miller still thought about him sometimes. He opened his eyes, sighed, and reached for a blank page. He began writing a list. Observe Henderson's next class unannounced. Speak privately with Mrs. Collins and Eli's homeroom teacher. Find out if other students have similar experiences. At the bottom, he added one final line, underlined twice. This is not about punishment. It's about healing. Meanwhile, Mr. Henderson was beginning to sense something. He noticed the principal's visits, the quiet glances from Mrs. Collins, even the way some students had grown uneasy around him. He told himself it was paranoia, but a small voice inside whispered otherwise. That Friday, he sat at his desk after school, staring at the empty classroom. The silence was heavy. He wasn't a cruel man, at least, he didn't think he was. He believed in discipline, in preparing students for the real world. But lately, he couldn't ignore the feeling that maybe he had gone too far. He thought of Eli, the way the boy had looked that day. Small, embarrassed. He'd told himself it was for his own good, but the memory wouldn't let him rest. He rubbed his temples. "It's just one kid," he muttered. "He'll get over it." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Outside, as he gathered his papers, he saw Principal Miller standing at the end of the hall, talking quietly to Mrs. Collins. Their conversation was calm, but something about their expressions told him it was serious. When they noticed him watching, Miller smiled and nodded politely, but his eyes held meaning. A quiet message. "I see you." Henderson looked away. The following Monday, the atmosphere in the school was different. Not tense, exactly, but watchful. Principal Miller continued his rounds, this time with a quiet determination. He made notes, asked gentle questions, and spoke to students between classes. When he asked one girl, "How do you feel about math class?" She hesitated before answering. "We learn a lot, but it's scary to get something wrong." He nodded, thanking her, and wrote it down. Later that day, he found Eli sitting alone under the maple tree. The boy was sketching, his pencil moving in slow circles. "Mind if I sit?" Miller asked. Eli looked up, startled. "Oh, sure, sir." The principal sat beside him on the bench, watching the branches sway above them. "You're quite an artist," he said softly. "May I see?" Eli hesitated, then turned the sketchbook toward him. The page showed a classroom drawn in detail, desks, a chalkboard, a single student sitting apart from the others. Above the student, dark clouds hovered. Miller studied it for a moment, then looked at Eli. "You capture feelings very well." Eli nodded, but said nothing. After a pause, Miller asked, "How's school been lately?" Eli shrugged. "It's okay." Miller smiled gently. "You know, asking questions, that's one of the bravest things a person can do. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." Eli looked up, his eyes searching the principal's face. For the first time in weeks, something like warmth flickered there. "Thanks," he whispered. As the principal stood to leave, he said quietly, "Sometimes people forget that teaching isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about helping others find theirs." Eli watched him walk away, a small weight lifting from his chest. That evening, Miller wrote his final note of the day. "Eli is beginning to heal. Henderson must too, but through reflection, not reprimand." He placed his pen down and looked out the window. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and violet. Justice, he thought, didn't always come from punishment. Sometimes it began with the simple act of being seen. And though the story was far from over, one thing was certain. The unseen witness had started something that could no longer be ignored. The week began like any other at Maplewood High. The morning bell rang, lockers slammed, the air smelled faintly of pencil dust and floor wax. But behind the calm hum of the day, something unseen was stirring. Principal Miller had spent the weekend reflecting. He'd reviewed his notes, replayed every detail, and drafted a plan that was neither punishment nor reprimand. It was an opportunity for truth to reveal itself. He called it the Classroom Empathy Review. Officially, it was part of a new teacher development initiative, a chance to observe different teaching styles and share best practices. Unofficially, it was his way of holding up a mirror. Monday morning, he sent an email to the staff. "Good morning, team. This week, we'll be conducting surprise peer evaluations to help strengthen our classroom engagement. Teachers will be visited by colleagues and administrators at random times. The goal: observe, share, grow." It was carefully worded, professional, friendly, and neutral. No one suspected a thing. By Wednesday, the program was underway. Teachers whispered about who had been visited so far, some nervous, others indifferent. Mr. Henderson received his notice that morning. Observation scheduled today. Third period. P. Miller. He frowned at the paper. Third period was his advanced math class, usually his most structured, but also the one with Eli in it. He straightened his tie in the reflection of the classroom window. "Fine," he thought. "Let them watch. I run a tight ship." The bell rang. Students shuffled in, chatting softly. Eli took his usual seat by the window. Henderson began, voice crisp. "Good morning. Let's settle down quickly. We'll be reviewing reciprocal division today." The door opened. Principal Miller stepped in, clipboard in hand. Beside him was Mrs. Collins, holding a notebook. Both smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," said Miller. "Please continue as usual. We're just observing." Henderson nodded stiffly. "Of course." The students straightened. The room filled with that strange tension that always followed an adult with authority. Miller walked quietly to the back of the classroom, taking a seat in the corner. He folded his hands, eyes calm but sharp. Mr. Henderson began teaching, his tone formal, precise. He wrote on the board, 2/3 divided by 4/5 equals. "Now, who can tell me what the first step is?" he asked, scanning the room. Silence. A few students avoided eye contact. He frowned slightly. "Come on, this is simple. We've done this before." In the back, Miller observed the stiffness of the class, how students seemed afraid to speak, how silence filled the space between words. Finally, Eli raised his hand halfway, hesitating. Henderson's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Yes, Eli." Eli spoke softly. "You flip the second fraction and multiply." "Correct," Henderson said. "At least someone remembers." There was an awkward laugh from the back of the room. Eli's shoulders tensed. Miller's pen moved across the clipboard slowly. Mrs. Collins's brows furrowed as she jotted her own notes. Henderson continued, "Now, if we all paid attention the first time, we wouldn't waste time reviewing. You need to." He stopped when Miller's voice cut through the air, gentle but firm. "Mr. Henderson," Miller said, "may I ask you something?" The teacher turned, startled. "Of course, sir. Could you explain why we invert the divisor when dividing fractions?" Miller asked casually. "It's a concept that often confuses students, even adults. I'd love to hear your explanation for the class." Henderson blinked. For a second, his face froze. The question, innocent on the surface, pierced deeper than it seemed. "Well, it's just the rule," he said. "It's how division of fractions works." Miller smiled faintly. "Yes, but why does it work that way?" The students looked from the principal to their teacher. The room was completely still. Henderson cleared his throat. It's part of the reciprocal property. You flip the divisor so the operation becomes multiplication." "Exactly," said Miller, nodding, still calm. "And sometimes, understanding the reason behind a rule helps students feel confident asking questions, even when those questions seem simple." A few students exchanged glances. Eli's eyes widened slightly. Miller continued, addressing the class directly now. "There's no such thing as a dumb question in learning. In fact, the best questions often sound simple, because they uncover what everyone else was too afraid to ask." The tension broke like glass. A hush fell, not awkward, but heavy with realization d'amar. Henderson stood still, his jaw tightening slightly. He felt the weight of the words, and the eyes of his students, pressing against him. Principal Miller's voice was never harsh, never accusatory, but it was surgical, precise. Every sentence had been a quiet move on a chessboard, cornering him not with power, but with truth. "Would you agree, Mr. Henderson?" Miller asked finally. Henderson hesitated. His instinct was to defend, to brush it off, but something in the principal's calm expression stopped him. He exhaled slowly. "Yes, I would agree." "Good," Miller said with a warm smile. "Then perhaps, as a team, we can encourage more curiosity in the classroom. It's the foundation of real understanding." The room seemed to breathe again. Students relaxed. Eli's eyes dropped to his notebook, hiding a faint smile. Mrs. Collins closed her notebook gently, her eyes shining with quiet satisfaction. The observation ended 15 minutes later. Miller thanked the class for their participation and left the room with the same calmness he'd entered with. But for Mr. Henderson, the air still felt heavy, not with humiliation, but with something harder to face: reflection. That afternoon, Miller invited Henderson to his office. The principal's desk was neatly arranged. No tension, no formality beyond what was needed. "Please have a seat," Miller said. Henderson sat stiffly, his hands clasped. "I wanted to thank you for letting us observe today," the principal began. "Your classroom runs efficiently. The students clearly follow your structure." "Thank you," Henderson said cautiously. Miller leaned forward slightly. "But I also noticed something. They follow instructions well, but they don't seem comfortable making mistakes." Henderson frowned. "I run a disciplined class, sir. Kids need structure." "They do," Miller agreed. "But they also need space to think, to wonder, to fail safely. Curiosity is a fragile thing, Mr. Henderson. Once broken, it doesn't always grow back." The room was quiet. Only the soft hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. Miller continued gently, "We're all guilty of forgetting that sometimes. Even I have been. The challenge isn't about control. It's about trust. You have their minds, yes. But you also hold their confidence." Henderson's eyes lowered. "I didn't mean to hurt the boy," he said quietly. "I just wanted him to take learning seriously." "I know," Miller replied softly. "But learning seriously doesn't mean learning in fear." He stood and walked to the window. "You've been a teacher for years, and your results speak for themselves. But your legacy won't be test scores. It'll be how your students remember feeling in your class." Henderson looked down at his hands. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally he said, "I understand." Miller turned and smiled. "Good. Because tomorrow I want you to help me with something." Henderson looked up. "With what?" "A workshop for the staff, on how to foster courage in students who are afraid to ask questions." It wasn't punishment. It was redemption. The next day, Maplewood's teachers gathered in the library for the workshop. The title written on the board read, "Encouraging Curiosity, the Power of Questions." To everyone's surprise, Mr. Henderson was standing at the front beside Principal Miller. His posture was firm, but his voice carried a new gentleness. He began, "Sometimes, as teachers, we forget that the smallest moments can leave the biggest marks. I did." The room was silent. Every word hung heavy in the air. He continued, "A student once asked me a simple question. I dismissed it, not because it was wrong, but because I was impatient. That moment changed more than I realized. It taught me that respect is not earned by authority, but by humility." Mrs. Collins smiled faintly from the back row. Eli, invited quietly by Miller to attend as a student representative, sat near the back, listening with wide eyes. For the first time, he saw his teacher not as an obstacle, but as a man learning too. When the session ended, Principal Miller stood. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Today, we were all students." The teachers applauded. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Henderson walked over to Eli. "Eli," he said softly, "your question was never dumb. It was brave, and I owe you an apology." Eli blinked, unsure what to say. "It's okay, sir." "No," Henderson said, shaking his head. "It wasn't. But it will be, if I can do better." For the first time in months, Eli smiled fully. "Thank you." Outside, the afternoon sun glowed through the library windows, dust motes floating in golden light. Principal Miller watched from a distance, his heart quiet with satisfaction. His plan hadn't been about exposing anyone. It had been about healing two souls on opposite ends of a single mistake. As he turned to leave, he thought to himself, "Justice isn't about making someone pay. It's about helping them see." The day after the workshop, Maplewood High felt different. The air carried a strange lightness, the kind that lingers after rain when everything smells clean and new. Students moved through the halls unaware of what had just shifted beneath the surface. But for Mr. Henderson, nothing felt the same. He sat alone in his classroom before the first bell. The desks were empty, sunlight spilling across the rows in long, golden streaks. He traced a finger across the chalk-dusted edge of his desk and let out a slow breath. He wasn't used to silence. Not this kind. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of control. It was reflection. It was weight. Yesterday, he had stood before the entire staff and admitted what he'd done wrong. He hadn't expected applause, or even forgiveness, only honesty. But what he didn't anticipate was how it would feel afterward. Vulnerability, relief, shame, all braided together into something strangely freeing. He thought about what Principal Miller had said after the meeting. "When you stand in truth, you don't fall, you grow." The words had stayed with him all night. He looked around the room, at the posters, the equations, the empty desks, and wondered how many students had once sat there afraid to speak because of him. Then he thought of Eli. He remembered the look on the boy's face that day, red cheeks, eyes downcast, trying to disappear. And he remembered the way Eli's eyes had lit up yesterday when he apologized. That memory hurt in the best way, like a wound finally beginning to heal. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. "Come in," Henderson said. Principal Miller stepped inside, his usual calm presence filling the room like a steady current. He smiled faintly. "Morning, Thomas." "Morning, sir." "I wanted to thank you again for yesterday," Miller said, taking a seat at one of the student desks. "It takes courage to face yourself in front of others." Henderson nodded slowly. "I didn't sleep much last night." "Reflection does that," Miller said kindly. "It's the mind rearranging itself." Henderson gave a small laugh. "That's one way to put it." Miller studied him for a moment. "You've been here a long time, Thomas. Good teacher. Results-driven. Consistent. But teaching isn't just about results. It's about resonance." "Resonance." "Yes. How your students feel long after they leave your class." Henderson leaned back, thoughtful. "I used to think I had to be the authority, the one they feared so they'd learn discipline. My own teachers were like that." Miller nodded. "And did you love learning because of them, or in spite of them?" The question landed softly but deeply. Henderson didn't answer right away. Finally he said, "In spite of them." Miller smiled. "Then maybe it's time to be the teacher you needed back then." For a long time they sat in companionable silence, two educators, not principal and subordinate, but equals in the craft of shaping young hearts. "Before leaving," Miller said, "I'm observing your class again today. Not for evaluation, just to see how your new approach feels." Henderson nodded, his nerves buzzing, but this time it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. Third period arrived. Students filed into room 2B as usual, chatting lightly. The smell of dry markers and warm sunlight filled the space. Eli took his usual seat by the window, sketchbook peeking from his bag. Mr. Henderson stood by the board, marker in hand, but today his demeanor was softer. He smiled, something rare but genuine. "Good morning, everyone." The class murmured a greeting, cautious but curious. "Today," he said, "we're not just solving equations. We're solving something more interesting. Why those equations work." That word, why, caught Eli's attention immediately. Henderson continued, "When I teach you math, I don't want you to memorize it like a magic trick. I want you to understand the story behind it." He drew two fractions on the board, 3/4 divided by 1/2. Then, turning to the class, he said, "Someone once asked me why we flip the second fraction when we divide. It was a great question, one I should have answered better." The students glanced at each other. A few looked at Eli, who froze in his seat. Henderson smiled gently. "Who wants to explore that with me?" For a moment silence filled the room, but this time it was expectant, not fearful. Then, slowly, Eli raised his hand. "Yes, Eli." Eli's voice trembled slightly. "Because dividing by something smaller means you can fit more of it into the first number. It's kind of the opposite of multiplying." Henderson's face softened. "Exactly. Beautifully put." Eli blinked. "Really, really," Henderson said. "You just explained what mathematicians call the reciprocal concept, something most adults forget how to describe." Laughter rippled through the room, warm this time, not cruel. The tension that had once hung over them was gone. Henderson glanced toward the back of the room, where Principal Miller stood quietly, arms folded, a faint smile playing on his lips. This time, Henderson didn't feel watched. He felt supported. After class, the students left chatting happily. Eli lingered to pack his things, careful as always. Henderson walked over. "Good work today," he said. Eli looked up. "Thanks, sir. You reminded me why I became a teacher," Henderson added. "To see minds like yours think, not just repeat." Eli smiled shyly. "My mom always says it's okay to ask questions." I almost stopped believing her. Henderson's voice was low. "Don't ever stop. The world needs more people who ask." When Eli left, the room fell silent again, but it was a peaceful silence, filled with the warmth of change. Henderson turned to the window. His reflection stared back at him, the same face, but not the same man. He thought of all the years he had taught like a commander instead of a guide. He whispered to his reflection, "You were teaching fear. Now, teach curiosity." News of the new Henderson spread quickly. Students who had once feared his classes began participating more. Laughter found its way into lessons. He still demanded excellence, but now it was paired with kindness, a steady mix of challenge and encouragement. One day, during a staff meeting, Mrs. Collins leaned over to Principal Miller and whispered, "You've worked magic." Miller smiled faintly. "Not magic, mirrors." Meanwhile, Eli blossomed quietly. His confidence returned like spring after a long winter. He began volunteering answers in other subjects, even helping classmates understand difficult problems. One afternoon, during lunch, a classmate asked him, "Hey, how come you're so good at explaining stuff?" Eli thought for a moment and smiled. "Because I stopped being scared of sounding dumb." The other boy nodded. "That's actually kinda cool." For the first time, Eli didn't feel like the quiet kid by the window. He felt like someone who mattered. News of the new Henderson spread quickly. Students who had once feared his classes began participating more. Laughter found its way into lessons. He still demanded excellence, but now it was paired with kindness, a steady mix of challenge and encouragement. One day, during a staff meeting, Mrs. Collins leaned over to Principal Miller and whispered, "You've worked magic." Miller smiled faintly. Not magic, mirrors. Meanwhile, Eli blossomed quietly. His confidence returned like spring after a long winter. He began volunteering answers in other subjects, even helping classmates understand difficult problems. One afternoon, during lunch, a classmate asked him, "Hey, how come you're so good at explaining stuff?" Eli thought for a moment and smiled. "Because I stopped being scared of sounding dumb." The other boy nodded. "That's actually kinda cool." For the first time, Eli didn't feel like the quiet kid by the window. He felt like someone who mattered. At the end of the semester, the school held its annual assembly, a gathering to recognize student and teacher achievements. The gym buzzed with chatter, the air warm with excitement. Principal Miller stepped up to the microphone. "Today," he said, "we celebrate not just grades or awards, but growth. The kind of growth that changes how we treat one another." He turned toward the rows of teachers. "I want to acknowledge someone who reminded us that humility is strength, that teaching is also learning." Mr. Henderson looked down, realizing what was happening. Miller continued, "And I also want to recognize a student whose curiosity became the spark that taught us all something invaluable." Eli froze. "Eli Turner," said the principal, smiling. "Your courage to ask a simple question reminded this entire school of what learning truly means." The gym erupted in applause. Eli's face turned red, but this time it wasn't from shame, it was pride. He looked at his teacher, who clapped the loudest. Henderson stood and spoke softly, just loud enough for those around him to hear. "You taught me more than I taught you." Miller watched the scene unfold from the stage. The teacher humbled, the student elevated, the balance of justice restored through compassion. In that moment, the principal thought, this is what leadership means. Not control, not fear, but the quiet art of helping others find their better selves. The applause faded. The assembly ended. Students spilled into the hallways, still buzzing. Outside, under the same maple tree where everything had begun, Eli sat again, only this time his head was high. He opened his sketchbook, drawing the tree and, beneath it, a classroom full of light. He titled it, "The Day a Question Changed Everything." The sun rose gently over Maplewood High, spilling golden light across the school's brick walls. It had been months since that assembly, months since one question reshaped the heart of an entire community. And though the world outside moved on as usual, inside Maplewood, something fundamental had changed. Students no longer whispered when someone raised their hand. Teachers paused to explain the why behind the how. Questions weren't interruptions anymore. They were invitations. The atmosphere was lighter, warmer. Even the hall seemed different, still noisy, still full of life, but buzzing with a kind of openness that hadn't existed before. In room 2B, laughter came easily now. The once silent walls had learned to echo not with fear, but with curiosity. Mr. Henderson stood by the whiteboard, finishing the morning's lesson plan. His posture was relaxed, his tone lighter, his patience deeper. The students respected him, not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. He caught his reflection in the glass window and smiled softly. He wasn't the same teacher anymore, and he didn't want to be. Later that afternoon, Mr. Henderson sat in the teacher's lounge, sipping his coffee, now lukewarm from long reflection. Across from him, Mrs. Collins smiled over the rim of her teacup. "You've changed, Thomas," she said with a knowing tone. He chuckled quietly. "Guess I finally learned to teach." "Oh, you taught before," she said. "You just didn't listen." He nodded. "You're right. For years, I thought my job was to fill their heads. Turns out, it's to open their minds." She raised her cup. To open minds. They clinked mugs softly, two teachers sharing the kind of moment that didn't need more words. As the day ended, Henderson packed his things and looked once more at the empty classroom. He paused by Eli's old seat, the window one, and smiled. He remembered the boy's courage, that single, trembling question that had forced him to look in the mirror. Now, that mirror no longer reflected a man of control. It reflected a man who had learned humility. He whispered, "Thank you, Eli." By spring, Eli Turner had become something of a quiet symbol in the school. He didn't change overnight. He still preferred sketches and quiet corners, but he'd found a new strength in his voice. His story had spread beyond room 2B. Other students heard what happened, how a simple question had sparked a chain reaction of kindness. One afternoon, Principal Miller called Eli into his office. The boy hesitated at the door, unsure if he was in trouble. Miller smiled. "Relax, Eli. I just wanted to ask you something." Eli nodded cautiously. "Yes, sir. How would you feel about speaking at the student assembly next month?" Eli blinked. "Me? Why?" Miller leaned back in his chair. "Because this school is changing, and it started with you. I think your story could help others find their voice too." Eli's stomach fluttered with nerves. "I don't really like talking in front of people." Miller smiled gently. "That's exactly why you should. Courage isn't about being fearless, Eli. It's about standing up even when you're scared." The boy thought for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I'll try." The day of the assembly arrived. The gym buzzed with chatter, sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Banners hung from the walls. Maplewood cares. Ask. Learn. Grow. Eli stood backstage, fidgeting with the small note cards in his hands. He could hear hundreds of students talking on the other side of the curtain. Mr. Henderson approached quietly. "Nervous?" Eli nodded. "A little." The teacher smiled. "Good. That means you care. Just speak from the heart. You'll be fine." Eli looked up at him. "Thanks for everything." Henderson's eyes softened. "No, Eli. Thank you. You reminded me what teaching really means." When the principal called his name, Eli stepped onto the stage. The gym fell silent. He stood behind the microphone, the note cards trembling slightly in his hands. He looked out over the sea of faces, classmates, teachers, even janitors and parents, all waiting. He took a breath. "Hi. My name's Eli Turner." A few encouraging smiles from the front row helped him steady his voice. "I used to be scared of asking questions. Not because I didn't care, but because I thought it made me look dumb. One day I asked a question in class, and it didn't go very well. A ripple of laughter, soft, understanding, moved through the crowd. But something happened after that. People listened. Things changed. And I learned that questions aren't signs of weakness. They're signs of courage." He paused, looking down at his cards, then set them aside. "I guess what I'm trying to say is, don't ever be afraid to ask, even if people laugh, even if someone doesn't understand you. Because the truth is, questions make us human." Applause broke out, slow at first, then swelling until the entire gym was clapping. Eli smiled through tears he didn't expect. He looked at Mr. Henderson, who stood clapping with pride, and at Principal Miller, who nodded with a quiet, knowing smile. In the months that followed, Maplewood High became known for something special. Teachers started curiosity corners, bulletin boards where students could anonymously post questions, no matter how simple or strange. Every Friday, one question was chosen for open discussion. Posters appeared in hallways with hand-drawn phrases like, "Every genius once asked, why? No question too small. Curiosity is courage." The culture shifted from quiet compliance to shared wonder. Students who once hesitated now debated, asked, challenged, explored. Even shy kids began to speak up, not because they suddenly became confident, but because they felt safe. And behind it all, Principal Miller continued his quiet leadership, never boasting, never drawing attention, just watching, guiding, and smiling whenever he saw the light of curiosity flicker in a student's eyes. That summer, Mr. Henderson attended a regional educators' conference. He had been invited to speak on a panel titled, "The Modern Classroom, From Fear to Freedom." He stood before a room full of teachers, some experienced, some brand new, and shared his story. He spoke openly about his mistake, about the boy who had changed his outlook, and about how curiosity had reshaped his teaching philosophy. When he finished, the audience stood and applauded. Later, a young teacher approached him, eyes wide. "I needed to hear that," she said. "I've been so focused on control that I forgot why I started teaching." Henderson smiled. "Then you're already learning again." That night, as he sat alone in his hotel room, he opened his laptop and began drafting an article. "The day a student taught me how to teach." He didn't write it for recognition. He wrote it because he wanted others to see what he had seen, that humility was not the opposite of strength, but its foundation. Years later, Eli would return to Maplewood as a guest speaker for the graduating class. He was older now, more confident, more thoughtful, but his message hadn't changed. He stood on the same stage where he once trembled and said, "Sometimes it takes one moment of humiliation to build a lifetime of courage, one question to change the course of a classroom, one act of kindness to rebuild trust." He paused, letting the silence breathe. "I asked a question once, a dumb one. But that question taught me everything I needed to know about the world. That curiosity is never weakness, that the right teacher can change your life, and that sometimes the smallest voice can start the biggest change." The audience was silent, the kind of silence that means hearts are full. As he walked off stage, Principal Miller, now retired but still attending, greeted him at the side stairs. "You did well," the old man said warmly. "You spoke truth. That's all the world ever really needs." Eli smiled. "You taught me that." Miller shook his head. "No, you taught me." They both laughed quietly. Outside, under the same maple tree that had witnessed everything, Eli stood for a while, watching the leaves sway. He thought about his younger self, the boy who once believed that silence was safer than speaking. He looked up at the branches and whispered, "If someone ever tells you your question is dumb, remember this story." The wind rustled the leaves, as if answering back, and for a brief, perfect moment, the whole world seemed to smile.